Hey everyone, how's it going? Welcome back to the next lesson on how to create a multiplayer game inside of Unity. In our last tutorial, we showed you how to set up the Photon plugin within your project, and in this lesson, we wanted to show you how to create rooms that other players can then join. So let's get started. Alright, so here we have our project open inside of Unity, and the first thing I want to do is create a new script. Now within my project window, you can see that I've already created a scripts folder, and within that folder, I have another one called Photon. Within this folder, we can save all of our multiplayer related scripts. And so let's go ahead and right click within this folder and go to Create and then C# script. And let's name this script PhotonLobby. Now this script will be responsible for setting up connections between the player and the Photon servers, and it will also allow the players to either join an existing room or create a new room if one is not available. So let's go ahead and open the script in Visual Studios. Now before we get started with our code, I want to point you in the direction of two helpful sources. The first is the documentation for the Photon plugin, and the second is the Photon API. Both of these are linked in the description below, and if you'd like to, you can open these in a separate tab, and then anytime I make reference to a Photon class or a Photon function, you can look those up within the documentation and find out more information. Now on with the code. So the first thing that we want to do is create some variables. And the first variable that we want to create is what's called a singleton. Now a singleton is basically a static variable which is of the same data type as the class in which this variable exists. So for our case, it'll be PhotonLobby. Now let's go ahead and create the singleton by typing public static PhotonLobby, and let's call this variable lobby and leave it with the semicolon. Now a singleton is used to reference the single instance of a class within our project. And so for example, within our main menu scene, we're only ever going to have one game object with the PhotonLobby script attached to it. We'll then save that single instance into this variable, and because it's a static variable, other scripts are going to be able to reference this script and have access to it. Now if you want to learn more about the principle of singletons, in the near future I'll do a whole video just based on singletons. They're really helpful and I use them all the time. The next variable that we want to create is a game object variable, and so I'm going to type public game object, and then let's call this variable battle button. Now when it comes to mobile games, I'm a really big fan of the single-click multiplayer, and what I mean by this is having one big button that says something like battle or PvP, that when the players click that button, they're instantly connected with other players. Examples of this are games like Slither.io or Clash Royale. Now this battle button variable is going to be that big button, and when a player clicks this button, they're instantly going to start searching for available rooms. Now there's probably going to be more variables that we can add to this list as we go along, but let's start in with our code. So the first thing that we want to do is initialize our singleton, and we'll do this within the awake function. So I'm going to type private void awake and then parentheses and curly braces. Within this function, I'm going to type lobby equals this. Now the word this is a keyword that is used to reference the instance of the class in which this line of code exists. Another way of looking at it is it's kind of like using get component to access a different class, but instead of accessing a different class, we're accessing this instance of the PhotonLobby class. Make sure that you add a semicolon, and here I've added a comment to help me document my code. So now that we've created a singleton, let's go ahead and set up a connection between the players and the Photon server. And we'll do this within the start function. Now to set up a connection to the Photon servers, we first have to access the Photon network class. And so I'm going to type Photon network dot, and here you can see that the Photon network class is not recognized, and that's because we need to include a namespace up at the top. But rather than typing it all out, I'm actually just going to click on Photon network, and then I'm going to hold Alt and press Enter. And here you can see that there's this drop-down menu, and the first option is to add using Photon.PUN up at the top. So I'm going to click on that, and now you can see that it's added the line using Photon.PUN up at the top. I've also gone ahead and added the line using Photon.realtime, so you can make sure that you have that namespace too. Now back down to our start function. In order to set up the connection, we need to call the function connect using settings, and we'll add parentheses and a semicolon. Now, an interesting fact about this function is that in the classic version of the Photon plugin, it actually had you pass in a string value as a parameter to this function, which would be the version number of your game. This would make it so that if you had two different versions of your game that you knew were not compatible with one another because of updates that you had made to the multiplayer, you could then change the value of this parameter, and those two versions would no longer connect with one another over the Photon servers. But with the new Photon 2 plugin, they've actually done away with the need to pass in a parameter to this function, and they've actually taken that value and put it into a separate file within Unity. So let's go ahead and have a look at that file. Inside Unity, we're going to go over to the search box of the project window, and we're going to type Photon Server Settings. And here you can see that there's one file by that name, so we'll go ahead and select that. And within the inspector, you can see a number of different options, but the option that we're looking for is the app version. So now if you make changes to your multiplayer gameplay and you know that the new version won't be compatible with older versions of your game, then you'll need to make sure that you increment the app version value. And so let's go ahead and just add a 0 in there for now, and we'll go back to Visual Studios. Now that we're back inside Visual Studios, I want to point out that this function, the connect using settings function, is essentially us trying to set up a connection to the Photon servers. And so what's going to happen is it's going to give us some feedback on whether or not that connection was successful or not. And so in order to access that feedback, we need to use a callback function. And so the callback function that we need to use is called onConnectedToMaster. And we're going to override this callback function. So I'm going to type public override void and then onConnectedToMaster, parentheses and curly braces. And now you can see that this function is not recognized as a function that we can override, and that's because we need to inherit from a different class. And so right now our PhotonLobby is inheriting from monoBehavior, but instead we want to change that to monoBehavior PUN callbacks. Now the onConnectedToMaster function will automatically be called when we've successfully established a connection to the Photon server. Now I've gone ahead and added a simple debug statement to identify where we are in our code as it executes. And the next thing that we want to do is enable the battle button. And so because we've established a successful connection to the Photon servers, we can then allow the players to click the battle button and start searching for a room to join. And so to do this, I'm going to type battlebutton.setActive, and then in parentheses I'm going to type true and leave it with a semicolon. The next thing that we want to do is create a public function that we can pair to this battle button. And so I'm going to type public void, and then we can call this function onBattleButtonClicked, parentheses and curly braces. Within this function, we are going to call a special Photon networking function. And so we're going to type Photon network and then dot, and the function that we're looking for is join random room, parentheses and semicolon. This is a special function that the Photon plugin provides, which essentially looks at all the available rooms and then picks one at random for our player to join. Now there's another special callback function that we're going to use, which is the onJoinRandomFailed function. And so I'm going to type public override void onJoinRandomFailed, and it will automatically complete it. And here you can see that there are two parameters. One is a short and it's called return code, and the second is a string called message. Now I've gone ahead and added a debug statement here, but what's essentially happening is that this function will automatically be called when our players fail to join a random room. And the most common reason for our players failing to join a room is that there's no room available. And so what we're going to do inside this function is create a new room. And so the first thing we're going to do is create a new int value. So I'm going to type int, and then the variable name is going to be random room name. And we're going to set that equal to random.range, and the ranges will be 0 to, we'll say, 10,000. On the next line of code, we need to create another variable, and this is going to be of type room options. So I'm going to type room options equals room ops. Now, a room options variable is used to set certain values associated with the room that you're trying to create. These values could be whether or not the room is public, whether or not the room is open, and also the player size of the room. And so we're going to set the values of our room ops variable by saying equals new room options, parentheses, and in curly braces we're going to type is visible equals true, comma, is open equals true, comma, and max players equals, we'll say 10 for now. We're then going to leave that line with a closing curly brace and a semicolon, and on the next line of code we're going to create the room. So we're going to say photonnetwork.createRoom, and inside this function we're going to first pass in the name of the room and then the room options. And so for the name of the room we're going to type quotes room and then close the quotes, and we'll say plus random room name. This way the chances of us trying to create duplicate rooms will be very small. Then we're going to say comma, and then we're going to add in the room ops variable. Now what we can do next is we can organize this code a little better. So I'm going to create another function which will be void create room, parentheses, curly brace. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut these 3 lines of code and add them into our create room function. And then after our debug statement, I'm just going to type create room, parentheses, and semicolon. Now, just in case we fail to create a new room, there's another callback function that we're going to use. And so we're going to type public override void, and the function is on create room failed. And here you can see there's 2 more parameters. It's a short called return code, and then the second one is a string called message. Now I've gone ahead and added a debug statement, but what's most likely happening here, and the reason why we're failing to create a room, is that there already exists a room by the same name that we're trying to create. And so this function will automatically be called when our player fails to create a room. And so what we can then do is just try to create another room. And so I'm going to type create room, parentheses, semicolon. So even though we're using the random room name variable to minimize the chance of us creating a duplicate room, there's still a possible chance. So we then need to make sure that we're calling this onCreateRoomFailed function so that we can then retry to create a room. Now there's one more variable that we need to add to the top of our script. So let's scroll up and we'll type public GameObject, and this will be for the cancel button. And so we're going to have a battle button which will start the search for an available room. But if we're still searching for an available room and we want to stop searching, then we'll have a cancel button that the players can click. And then let's scroll down to our onBattleButtonClicked function, and here we'll add 2 lines of code. The first one will be BattleButton.setActive, and we'll pass in false. And then the second line will be CancelButton.setActive, and we'll pass in true. Next, let's scroll down to the bottom of our script where we can then create a function that we can pair to our cancel button. So I'm going to type public void, and then the function will be called onCancelButtonClicked, parentheses and curly braces. Inside this function, we'll type CancelButton.setActive, and we'll pass in false. And then we'll type BattleButton.setActive, and we'll pass in true. And then what we need to do is leave the room, and there's a special function which is part of the Photon Network class. So I'm going to type Photon Network dot, and the function is called leave room, parentheses and semicolon. And now we'll go back to Unity and set up our lobby controller game object. Once we're back in Unity, we'll go ahead and create an empty game object by going to the Create drop-down menu in the Hierarchy window and selecting Create Empty. We'll then give this game object the name Lobby Controller, and then we'll find our PhotonLobby script and click and drag it onto the inspector. We'll then go ahead and create our battle and cancel buttons. So I'm going to go to the Create drop-down menu, go to UI and select Button. I'm then going to reposition and resize this button. I'm then going to change the text so that it fits the size of our button, and I'm going to change it so that it says Battle. I'm then going to duplicate this button twice. Once will be for the cancel button, and the second will be for when we're offline. I'll then go ahead and rename all these buttons, and I'll change the text on each of them. With the offline button, under the button component, we're going to deselect the interactable option. I'm then going to rearrange the order of these buttons so the offline button comes first in the hierarchy. This way the offline button will be behind the other 2 buttons. I'm then going to select both the battle button and the cancel button, and I'm going to disable them in the inspector. Then I'm going to select the lobby controller game object, and I'm going to set the values of both the battle button variable and the cancel button variable by clicking on those game objects in the hierarchy and dragging them into those fields. We then need to associate the functions to our battle and cancel buttons. So I'm going to select the battle button, and in the button component under onClick, I'm going to drag the lobby controller game object into this field. And then in the drop-down menu, I'm going to go to PhotonLobby and select On Battle Button Clicked. I'm then going to do the same thing for the Cancel button, so I'm going to select the Cancel button, and in the Button component under On Click, I'm going to drag the Lobby Controller game object into this field, and in the drop-down menu, I'm going to go to PhotonLobby and then select On Cancel Button Clicked. Alright, let's go ahead and play our game. And as it loads, we can see that it says offline, and as soon as it connects to the Photon server, it changes from offline to battle. I'll then go ahead and drag over this console window, and here we can see our debug messages. Now the first message says, received your user ID from server. This is a message that is implemented within the Photon plugin, and I believe it belongs to the connect using settings function. The next message is one of our own that says player has connected to the Photon master server. And so this message is implemented into the first callback function where we have connected to the Photon servers successfully. Now let's go ahead and see what happens when we click the battle button. Here you can see that we received one more debug statement of our own. This one says, tried to join a random game but failed. There must be no open games available. Now to give us a little more feedback as to what is happening, I'm going to go back to Visual Studios and add a few more debug statements. So the first debug statement I'm going to add into the On Battle Button Clicked function. The next debug statement I'm going to add into the Create Room function, and then I'm going to add one to the On Cancel Button Clicked function. And finally, there's one more debug statement that I would like to add, but we need to add this to another callback function. And the callback function is the On Joined Room function. And so I'm going to type public override void and then on joined room, parentheses and curly braces. Now this function will automatically be called when the player has successfully joined another room. And so let's add a debug statement in here. Now we can go ahead and save our code and go back to Unity. Once back in Unity, I'm going to play through our game again. So here we can see that we have those same two debug statements when we've connected to the Photon server. And then I'll go ahead and click the battle button. And now you can see that we get a few more debug statements so we can understand exactly what's happening. So first we have the battle button was clicked debug statement, which we added to the On Battle Button Clicked function. Then we get the same debug statement that says tried to join a random game but failed. There must be no open games available. And so because there's no open rooms available, we then try to create a room. And so we have the next debug statement that says trying to create a new room. And so this debug statement is called within our create room function. Then when we successfully create a room, we also join that room ourselves. And so we have this final debug statement which says we are now in a room. Now the last thing that we're going to do in this tutorial is build out our game so that we can have two instances of our game running, and then we can have one player create a room while the other player joins the room. So to do this, I'm going to go to File, Build Settings, and here I'm going to add the current scene by clicking the Add Open Scene button, and I'm also going to remove the sample scene from the build order. Then we need to click on the Player Settings button, and in the inspector we need to set our company name and our product name. And finally within the other settings we need to set the bundle identifier. Then I'll go back to our build settings and I'll click Build and I'll create a new folder to save our builds. I'll then open that folder and click Select Folder. We then need to wait for our game to finish building. Once it's finished building, I'll go ahead and run an instance of our game in the standalone platform. And all we have to do is wait for it to connect. There we go. So now I'm going to hit the battle button and now it says cancel, but we don't have any debug statements because we're in the standalone build. And so let's go back to Unity and we can close the build settings and then let's go ahead and run our game. Now that we've connected to the Photon server, all we have to do is click battle and we should receive different debug statements than we did when we were running just one instance of our game. As you can see here, we now have fewer debug statements than we did the last time we ran through our game. We're actually just missing two debug statements. The first one is the tried to join a random room but failed statement, and the second one is the trying to create a new room statement. Now what's happening here is that within our standalone version of the game, we're first trying to join a random room, but we end up failing because there's no room available. And so then we go into trying to create a room. And once we've successfully created a room, that room then becomes available for this instance of the game running in Unity. And so rather than failing to join a room, we actually have a success in joining a room, which then means that this instance of our game doesn't have to create a room. And that's the reason why we're receiving 2 less debug statements in Unity, because those debug statements have already happened in the standalone version. Now that's everything that we're going to cover in this lesson on how to create a multiplayer game inside of Unity. We were able to establish a connection to the Photon servers, and we were also able to create a method by which the players can either join an existing room or create a new room if one is not available. If you enjoyed this video and found it to be helpful, make sure that you give it a thumbs up and share it with your friends. Also make sure that you subscribe to our channel so you can be up to date on all our latest videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.